مرحبا. اليوم بدنا نحكي عن الجذر والوزن. Roots and patterns. Roots and patterns are at the very heart of Arabic. They are how Arabic makes words and how we make sense of words in Arabic. Much of our study of Arabic will involve learning more about the roots and the patterns throughout the language. But for now, we're just going to learn about the very concept of what is a root and what is a pattern. First, it's important to think about what a kelima is, a word. شو يعني kelima? In English, a word is usually just a word. You just get it out of the dictionary, you just know it, but you can add stuff to that word. So you can say, I hear, to hear, whatever. You can say that something was heard. Oh, that song was heard a lot on the radio. You can add more prefixes and suffixes to change the meaning. Unheard. That's unheard of. It's not something that's done, not something normally done. That's unhearable, right? If something is at a pitch that we can't understand, it's unhearable. And the meaning is all of those different pieces sort of put together. Hear is about being able to hear things with your ears. Hearable means I'm able to hear something, and unhearable negates that. It can't be heard. Notice that the hear part doesn't really change. It just stays the same. That center heart of the word is sort of the same. Occasionally in English we do have some words where like the inside of the word changes to change the meaning. So we say dog, dogs, cat, cats, but we also say mouse, mice, goose, geese, where the inside of the word itself is sort of what changes, and that changes the meaning. In Arabic, words aren't just words. Any word can be broken down further than an English word. In English, you can't say anything more about here, and then there's 4 letters in it. If you say har, that's just a sound pirates make. If you say her, that means hers. It has nothing to do with here. In Arabic, we can actually break words down a little bit further into 2 constituent parts. A root, what we'll call in Arabic jadr, and a pattern, what we call in Arabic wazn. So Arabic words are a lot more like mice, where there's stuff going on in the inside of the word, than words like unhearable, where there's a lot of bits added on to the beginning and end, but there's this core section of the word. In Arabic, there are 2 core parts of the word, and they combine to make a word. Of course, we do know that Arabic has prefixes and suffixes. So the formal Arabic way of saying that they write is yaktubun. That ya part is a prefix, the un part is a suffix. Shu yani jadr. What is a root? Well, a root is 3 to 4 consonants, and they are just consonants. You can't say a root. You can try. Try to say kef, te, be as a word without any vowels or anything else. You probably just got a bunch of spit on your computer screen, if you tried. I don't necessarily recommend it. I don't think anyone can say 3 consonants in a row without any vowels. But a lot of words are drawn from that root by combining them with wazns, by combining them with patterns, and they produce real meaningful words. And when we look at all the words from a root, we get a sense of what the root means. So this root, kataba, shows up in the word kitab, a book. It shows up in the word yaktub, he writes. It shows up in the word mekteb, a desk. It shows up in the word mektaba, a library. All these things have something to do with writing, with books, with words on pages. So we could say that this root has something to do with writing. But all those individual words are not the root. They have the root in them, but we can distill that root down. Shu yani wazn. Patterns. What are patterns? Patterns are where we take the root and we fit it into a template made up of vowels and sometimes consonants, but mostly vowels. And we slot those 3 letters from the root into the template. And we're going to see more examples of this. You've already started noticing some words that are similar. So we have a whole bunch of words that kind of rhyme, but don't quite rhyme in the sense that we think of as in English. We can say كبير, صغير, طويل, قصير, غريب, مريض. In every one of these words, we sort of have a, e, a, e. You can think of it as sort of the first consonant, followed by an a sound. Then you have another consonant. You have an e sound. You have another consonant. So what really is a word in Arabic? Every single word in Arabic can be distilled down to its wazn, which is the sort of specific meaning that's mostly just vowels, combined with al-jadr, which is the general meaning, but it can't be pronounced because it doesn't have vowels, because it's just a bunch of consonants that are stuck together that sort of float in space unconnected to one another. When we combine these things, ta-da! We have a kalima, a word. It's the combination of the root and the pattern, the general meaning of the root with the specific meaning of the pattern, and a combination of meaning taken from the root and pronunciation taken from the pattern. These things combine and are complementary to one another. So you can visualize al-jadr, as I said, as being kind of disconnected letters, right? They're not connected to one another, they don't make a word, they're just sort of three letters. And you can think of the wazn as a template, as sort of a place where you can slot those letters into them. So here we have, on the left, we have our jadr, our root, which is ka, ba, ra, which I like to sort of think of as bigness. It usually has to do with things that are big. We've heard kabir, we know that word. We've heard akbar, like Allahu Akbar, God is the biggest, the greatest thing, is what that phrase means. So this has to do with bigness. There's a verb that means kabura, which means to grow big, to grow up, to become an adult, etc., etc. Our wazn that we just talked about, our a-e wazn, it can be sort of visualized as this template. And we can kind of say that its specific meaning is that it makes adjectives, right? Kabir, صغير, قصير, طويل, all these things are adjectives. So let's combine the two. We slot our ka into the first slot, our ba into the second slot, and our ra into the third slot. And if we were to, see, we have this nice little template here. Now if we were to write this down underneath and actually connect all of the letters, we would have kabir, an adjective meaning big. We have bigness, the general idea of bigness, and we have an adjective form, and we have the adjective big. We can do the same thing with other adjectives and other roots, or other roots in the very same wazn, create different adjectives with different meanings based on the meaning of the root. So here our root, our jadr, is ta, wa, la, which has to do with length. So one of my favorite words is la tatawul. Don't spend a lot of time. Don't lengthen the time it takes to do something. We know the word tawila, which is sort of a long, tall thing. So here we're going to take this jadr and we're going to slot it in to our nice wazn, and we're going to make an adjective that way. So we go tall, wow, lamb. They go into those slots in order, just like a little template, almost like you're making an piece of IKEA furniture. You put things in the right place, and we have tawil, right? Very simple. We know this word, but now we understand the two parts that make it up. The jadr, which is sort of these consonants by themselves, get slotted into our template, which is the wazn, and we have a kalima, a word. So, why is this so important? Well, first, the most difficult part of Arabic is not the grammar. Believe me, it is not the grammar. We have two tenses of verbs, Sentences are pretty easy to make. We don't have a verb to be, so we don't have to learn 100,000 different ways of saying to be, he might be, in the possibility of the past it happened that such and such could have been. No, we don't have to deal with any of that stuff. But we do not have a lot of words from Arabic in English. They exist. Ironically, alcohol is an Arabic word, but it's nothing like French or Spanish, where lots of our words are shared due to a heritage and history of connection between English speakers and Spanish speakers and French speakers and German speakers. So our biggest struggle with Arabic is going to be vocabulary, because there's a lot of it. And one trick that will make learning all of our vocabulary easier is learning more and more about the wazn and the jadr. If you see words from the same jadr, you know that they're all going to revolve around a similar meaning. Similarly, you see words of the same wazn, you might start to learn certain awzaan, wazns, which have a particular meaning. So some wazns, awzaan, we say in Arabic, you'll recognize that particular pattern from the plurals. Some of these are very productive. You can just make any word, any root, slot it into this, and you'll get some sort of word. People might not necessarily use it, but they'll understand what you're trying to say usually. This works on the flip side. If we're reading something and we see a word that we've never seen before, but we know the root and we know the pattern, we can guess what it means. Now, this isn't always that great. There are some patterns that just don't have a clear single meaning, but we might know them nonetheless. And this is very helpful for pronouncing unfamiliar words. Arabic is a BYOV language, bring your own vowels. So when we see a text in Arabic, there's no vowels written in. Now that would theoretically be impossible for anyone to deal with if it weren't for the awzaan, for the wazns. For native speakers, they know so many words that if they see a word they've never seen before, they probably know the wazn, and they can guess how to say it. And we can use that same technique ourselves. So if we see this word, ayn, nun, ya, del, we don't know what the pronunciation should be. It could be unaid, it could be anaid. There could be all sorts of vowels in all sorts of weird places in this word. But we see that ya in the middle, and we can guess, we might not be right, but probably, if we know lots of words, we can guess that it's like I need, right? We know lots of words that go a-e, right? So we can guess that it's an ah sound. Now, some wazns do not necessarily have a meaning, but most words with that particular pattern are plural, diminutive, etc. We've seen this with the plurals, right? You could say that the plural patterns we've seen mean plural. It's a little more complicated than that, and it doesn't necessarily help. You can't necessarily predict the singular from the plural, or the other way around, the plural from the singular. But if you see a word like el-ab, you can notice the resemblance to ashab, awlad, ashya, and guess that it's some sort of plural. Similarly, this word that we just talked about, anid, we know that that's usually an adjective. We might not know what the root means, but we know that it's probably an adjective. In this case, it's an adjective meaning stubborn. Now, another important thing about understanding patterns is it's sometimes hard to figure out what the root of a word is. But if you know the pattern, you can subtract the pattern from that word, and you'll find the root, and vice versa. This is important when you use a dictionary. Arabic dictionaries are root-based. You look up the root. You don't just look up a whole word. You only look up those 3 consonants. So let's just talk a little bit about productive patterns. We're going to learn many of these as we learn Arabic, but just wanted to give you an example so that it makes more sense how these things end up working in real life. On our left, we have a jadr. We know this jadr, kataba. On our right, we have a really important wazn. This wazn has a meme at the beginning with a fatha on it, followed by a consonant with no vowel sound at all, followed by a consonant with a fatha, followed by another consonant, and it sometimes has a ta marbuta on it. Now, if you're really paying attention and thinking ahead, you already know what this word is, but let's make it using our template. The ka goes after the meme. The ta goes after that. Remember, these always go in order. And the ba ends up to the very end there. So we have this word, mekteb. Now, as I said, this wazn generally has the meaning of a place of doing something. Whatever the root is, this is a place of doing that. And that produces the word, a place of writing. That could be an office or a desk. Notice in Arabic, mekteb can mean desk, the place that you do your writing quite literally, or an office, the place in which you sit at a mekteb and do your writing. It means both those things. Again, we can do the same process, though we'll add the tamarbuta this time. Usually the tamarbuta comes in if there's already one word that has that's sort of reserved from this root already, like mekteb, right? We already have desk. Well, what if we want to talk about a place where there are books? We end up with mekteba. Now, we can apply this to other roots. And we can try to guess what this means, all right? So on the left we have darasa, which has the meaning of studying. We're going to combine it with our wazn of place of doing things. What are we going to get? We're going to get the word madrasa. Now, take a second. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. Think. What is a place of studying? Guess out loud, for real. Say it. Your roommates will look at you funny, but say what your guess is. All right? Were you right? Place of studying, a school, right? People always talk about Barack Obama going to an Islamic madrasa. Really, it just means school. So let's talk also about, so we've talked about how patterns productively can help us make new words and understand new words that we've never seen before. What are some other ways of using them? Say we're reading this sentence at the very top of the page. Baba biyashtaghl fi, this word, mim, ayn, mim, lam. Well, let's think about the pronunciation of this word first. Think to yourself in your head. I know words that start with mim, which mean place of, and that sound like mekteb, madrasa, mekteba. So if I were to say this with the same vowels, I'd end up with ma'amel. You can also think of the meaning half of it using this wazn. Words with a mim at the front often mean place of, right? We just learned that. Ayn, mim, lam means something like to work or to do, right? We've learned that word. Shub tamal bil weekend, right? So what happens if we combine to work or do with place of, a place of working or doing, right? The sentence says something about Baba, he works in this kind of a place. Maybe it means factory. Maybe it means lab, a place where people do things, right? Often it can mean either of those in Arabic, either a factory or a lab, depending on the country and the context, etc. Here's a similar conundrum. Ma andi, this word, l'saf. Maybe the ustaz is saying this sentence. So let's think about the pronunciation. First of all, you know words that look just like this, with an aleph, letter, letter, aleph, letter, right? Words like ashab, awlad. So you can guess that this is probably pronounced as awraq, right? There could be more consonants, different consonants. It could be uraq, it could be uraq, it could be awaraqa or something. But we already know what these other words are. We're used to it, so we can guess the meaning without even knowing. There are no vowels written in except the long vowels here, right? So we can guess the meaning. Guess the pronunciation. In terms of the meaning, you know that words which start with an aleph and have an aleph in the middle are often plurals. Ashab, awlad. Maybe this is also a plural. You can think, well, if that's the pattern, we can think of the root with wa, ra, and qa in it, right? Do we know any other words with that root? We do, if we remember our alif ba, which we probably don't. Ma'alish. We learned the word waraqa, a piece of paper. Then you can think to yourself, Does this make sense? Does this plural pieces of paper fit the context? I think it's a pretty good guess, right? I don't have the pieces of paper for the class, right? I forgot my handouts. Oh no, I need to run all the way back to Swan. Now, when we talk about these patterns, it's really important to think about how can we discuss patterns outside of Ustaz Alex's PowerPoint. We need some way to write them down, right? There's only a fairly limited number of awzaan, of patterns. How do we talk about a particular wazn, a particular pattern? We need some way that isn't these weird, awkward boxes in a PowerPoint slide, because how are you going to tell somebody, oh yeah, if I raise my hand, if I ask you, look at this new word we just read. What wazn is it? What's the pattern? What's the wazn? We need some way to be able to communicate it orally, to write it down. It's not just an awkward set of boxes. It takes a long time to write boxes. We need a better way to do this. Now, the solution that's been used in Arabic is to use an example root to show any wazn, right? So we just keep the root the same, and we just use an example, and then we fit it into all the different awzaan to talk about those awzaan. And back in about 800 AD, just, 1,200 years ago, somebody already came up with a solution to this. They use this wazn, fa, ayn, lam. This is a pain for us non-native speakers of Arabic who have trouble with our ayns, but it's tradition. Tradition. And this root has the meaning to do. Notice that sometimes it's going to show up a lot in our grammar. So the word fa'al means verb. This root is just used as an example. There aren't actually meaningful words from this root that fit every single wazn. Other languages and other traditions sometimes use a different root. In Hebrew and Semitics, in the study of Semitic languages, people often use the root qaf ta lam, which has something to do with to kill, but that's a little bit violent, so I kind of like this more non-violent approach. So we'll be seeing examples of this in a second, but we're going to denote the root always using fa, ayn, and lam, and then the pattern will be denoted by a nice connected word with those letters in it. This is a little bit like algebra, so don't be scared. We're not doing algebra, all right? I know everyone hates math almost as much as they hate Arabic, but in algebraic notation, we use variables, right? X, Y, and Z. In Arabic, we're going to be using fa, ayn, and lam instead. Think of equations. 2x plus 3y plus z squared, or x squared minus 2y plus 8z. Both these equations have x, y, and z in them, right? They're doing very different things in each of the equations, but there's an x, a y, and a z. So you can think of the x, y, and z as the root, and the coefficients, the squared symbols, the pluses and minuses are a little bit like the wazn. X, y, and z could be any numbers, just like fa, ayn, and lam could be replaced with any root that we could possibly want, any jadr that we could possibly want. So, how do we get to that notation? Well, we use the same template system. We just use our jadr of fa, ayn, and lam. So we're talking about our adjective form. How could we come up with a notation for that we could use to represent that form in all cases? Let's just slot fa, ayn, and lam into our template. Fa, ayn, lam, so we get the word fa'il. If you say, oh, this is the wazn fa'il, that can represent all words that have that wazn. And I'll show you how that works in a second. So, let's say that I'm going to use a new wazn, because we've seen so many examples of the old wazn, it'll be helpful to see a brand new one. So, we have this very common wazn. This is one of the most productive awzaan in all of Arabic, fa'il. It means one who does whatever the meaning of the root is. Okay? So let's combine that with this root that we already know, kataba. We end up with, so we have, down here we'll see, here's our wazn in our new wazn notation. It's like an algebra equation. We're going to slot in ka, ta, and ba. So we have a ka, ta, and ba, and they're going to replace the fa. They're going to replace the ayn, they're going to replace the ba, and we produce a word katib, which means one who writes, or a writer. So we could talk about a famous katib like William Shakespeare, a famous katib, right? One who writes. And we've combined the fa'il wazn with the kataba jadr, the fa'il pattern with the kataba root. We can go the opposite way. So say we know a bunch of different words that all sound kind of the same. So we have bunuk, sufuf, durus, buyut. Well, we can distill these down into their wazn notation by just replacing the consonants in those words with fa, ayn, and lam. And I'll do this twice so that you can see how it works for two different words. So, we replace the ba with fa, the noon with ayn, and the kaf with lam. Fu'ul. Same thing in the second one. We replace the sad with fa. We replace the fa with ayn, because it's the second letter. We replace the lam, the other fa with a lam. Notice how it's exactly the same. That's exactly how it should be, right? These words all have the same wazn. Notice, look on the left over here. We have a word judur. That is the same wazn as all these others, and it's very similar to a word we just heard. Guess, what does judur mean? I'm going to give you a few seconds. Make a fool of yourself. You're going to have to do it. Okay, now that your roommates have stopped laughing, let's see if you were right. This means roots. It's the plural, al-jama', of jadr. Judur. This fa, ayn, lam notation is used everywhere in teaching Arabic and has been for over 1,000 years. So, in your book, many students don't know this, but there's actually an entire set of grammar charts at the very end of al-kitaab. You can see this on page 310. For example, here is the complete conjugation of verbs in standard Arabic. And notice that each time that they exemplify the verb, they use fa, ayn, and lam. So in summary, roots, al-jadr. These are 3 to 4 consonants. Notice that ya and waw are ambiguous. They can act as both consonants and vowels. And that's going to be one of the tricky things that's going to always be with us in Arabic, is that there's this ambiguity. Roots express very, very general meaning. And they cannot be pronounced. There's no meaningful way to pronounce a root. Maybe Russians, who have lots of consonants in a row, might be able to do it. Polish speakers, I don't know, but you just can't do it in Arabic. Then we have patterns. Patterns are usually vowels. Sometimes there's some consonants. Remember we learned that mef'al, right? Mektab, mektaba, madrasa, where there's a meme at the very beginning, right? So sometimes there's a vowel that's part of a consonant that's part of the pattern. And these patterns act like templates in which we slot the roots. They have a much more specific meaning than the roots. They usually mean one who does blank, or plural form, something a little more specific than writing bigness. And it's usually a somewhat grammatical sort of meaning. In Arabic, all words are the combination, that beautiful meshing between a root and a pattern. Every single word could be said to be a combination of root plus pattern. Because that's so important, we have to have a special way of writing down patterns, making a notation of patterns. And so what we do is we use fa, ayn, and lam, just like we use x, y, and z in math, to represent the root consonants. And we use vowels and other letters. We make a written out word that looks like a word, but just with fa, ayn, and lam. And that is sort of a way of summarizing a pattern. I could say, give me a word from pattern mef'al, if you know any word. And you could be like, oh, mekteb, madrasa, etc. You can use those notations to make other people understand what you're talking about when you're talking about wazns, awzaan. شكراً.